So yep, this is the second session of the Marine and Coastal Management online workshops. And in yesterday's session, we did introduce the project more thoroughly and give a bit of a background to the workshop. So if you missed this session, then please let me know and I can share the recording with you so you can catch up. But just as a quick recap, this workshop series is part of the Darwin Plus funded project, the Technical Assistance Programme for Effective Coastal Marine Management in TCI. And this is a 3-year project which will conclude this July, and it's being delivered through a partnership between JNCC, DECR and SERI. So the aim of the project is to develop technical tools and methods to enhance the evidence base and to support effective assessment and management of marine and coastal resources. And then a key aspect of the project is to provide, is to deliver training on these tools, their purpose and how they can be applied in practice. So this is what we hope to cover in this series of online knowledge exchange workshops. And there'll be 4 online workshops, of which this is the second. And at the end of the month, there'll be a 3-day in-person workshop in Providenciales as well. So the focus of today's session is on assessing how marine life is coping under pressure, and it's a continuation of yesterday's session in which Johnny covered sensitivity assessments. So, yep, I'll hand over to David and Adam to cover today's session. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Today really kind of build on the discussion that we had yesterday on sensitivity assessments, really with a focus to how does that relate to understanding what the condition of the marine environment is and what methods and tools have been applied to try and bring that into something that can be used within a planning framework or a policy framework, and to show the results that we've had based on the data we've had so far and the ideas and questions that we've got along the way. And the questions are quite important because we really do need and very much look forward to any kind of feedback from yourselves. It's a complex topic, this, and a lot of it depends on what is a priority, what is seen as a priority, and how do you want to adapt to priority. So we'll want to take that forward. You know, we've got ideas, but you can only define something that'll work in practice by putting all the extraneous, the externalities into play as well. So Emma's introduced the project. So we've basically got a technical assistance project. A key output from this project is actually on the natural capital side of things, where we're looking at the asset register and how that links into services. What we're doing today is partly linked into that, but it's also linked into sort of wider monitoring and condition assessment work. And then next week, Laura's going to be talking about specific biodiversity indicators, which take you to a new level. But we'll explain the different elements that sort of go through it. So today, we didn't sort of ask the general question that we did yesterday, but it still comes back to what are your worries about the health of the sea, and what are other people's worries about the health of the sea. It starts obviously with an assumption that there is a concern, and how do you actually measure it, and why does it matter? So we're going to be looking at how we might look at health, and specifically use health here rather than condition, because the two terms they're very much the same sort of thing. And to people in the environmental sphere, condition is quite commonly used for looking at ecosystem condition and so on. Health is something that seems to get through to people not in the environmental sphere slightly easier. People understand what it means that if your health is poor, that you need to do something. So I will use the two terms interchangeably. We'll give a couple of examples from outside Turks and Caicos Islands, hopefully ones that are generally relevant, just showing how the techniques here have been used in the recent past to address similar concerns, although not really necessarily sort of similar habitats. And we're going to focus on 3 of the main benthic habitats in Turks and Caicos Islands, coral reefs, seagrass beds and sands, which does actually cover most of the shallow water areas at least. And I suppose I should say also that the focus of the work has been very much based on the areas close to the islands, that the wider EEZ is not at this stage included in this process. We're going to look at seagrass beds in particular because it has been a bit of a theme going through. The method is not specific to seagrass beds, but can be used for others. But when we get to talk about services from the ecosystems and we talk about the indicators, they will kind of focus more on the seagrass. So I wanted to bring them in here to show, but we're more than happy to talk about other things if need be. And where to take this. There's a number of different directions this could go in, and we've got ideas and also questions about how it could fit with what you're doing. So to recap on what we did yesterday, we asked about your concerns in terms of ecosystem health, which gave some very illuminating answers, and I've got a list of those sort of prepared here. So this was a sort of summary, providing I could read my notes, of what you all came up with in different guises, which is it's an interesting mix in terms of analysis, because some can be quite heavily associated with a particular data stream or data sets. Others are going to be much harder to actually quantify. And I will start up by admitting a bias. Just because something is difficult to quantify doesn't mean it shouldn't be included. But I think it's quite important that we start from the point that we're trying to look at what needs to be looked at rather than what can just what can be looked at. So we look at, yesterday we talked about the vulnerability concept in the main, and really then focus on what the activities are and how an activity turns into pressures. There's an awful lot of activities, individuals, which mean, and they're quite significant differences in terms of economics, but when it comes to what they may or may not do in terms of effects on, say, corals, the effects can be quite similar. So by talking about pressures, you are able to start analysing across a number of different activities, because from a biological point of view, the effect is going to be the same. And then a key thing that we went through yesterday, and again, thanks to Johnny for going through all this, was the sensitivity. It's a very important concept. It very much underpins the work we're trying to do with the vulnerability assessment. It's how you look at the response of any of the habitats that we're interested in to particular pressures. And there's 2 key elements to that. There's how it recovers once something's been damaged, and its resistance, or how it might avoid, or how it can get away with pressure in the first place. We'll only talk in this today about the overall sensitivity of a particular habitat, but it's always worth noting that these 2 are quite important. And when you start to look at things like time series and coming on to indicators, rate of recovery is actually quite key. I'm going to have a quick pause there just to say, make sure that everybody can see all the slides, and if anybody's got any particular questions they wanted to ask at this stage. No, that's fine. So we're going onto a chessboard. We'll go into where this came from, what it was for, a bit later on. But what we're solely using it at the moment is to give you a bit of an exercise in saying what you think about the health and where things are going. So at this stage, I'll hand over to Adam, if that's okay, and if you explain what we had in mind.
Yeah, thanks, David. So yeah, as David said yesterday, we kind of looked at what activities might be occurring in TCI that could be damaging to the ecosystem, to the marine ecosystems, and also looked at the potential key habitats that that we were focusing on and what activities they're sensitive to. But the vulnerability assessment side we're looking at now, we want to actually look at the locations of where these activities are occurring, and if there's any overlap with the habitats, and whether the habitats are sensitive to these activities, because that means they potentially be vulnerable. So yeah, we've got this grid here. So we're going to do a Slido poll. So yeah, I've put the link to Slido in the chat, and then I'll put the link to the poll. And basically, the first question is going to be identifying which grid cells damaging activities are occurring in. So people based on TCI, if you're aware of activities that could potentially be damaging the marine habitats, then look at which grid cell it's occurring in. So, and then type that into the Slido poll. So I'll just put the number in there. And if you go on Slido and type that number in, you should be able to see the question, which says in which grid cells are the damaging activities occurring. And then if you know of any areas where damaging activities are occurring, just type in, for example, G6. And then once we've got a few answers in, we can have a look at where we think the most activities are occurring. I mean, I'm guessing these are probably going to be closer to shore, but it'll be interesting to see what this comes up with.
So Adam, if you keep is there a sort of a tick over of answers? We can either sort of go through and then come back to the response bit if you want, or
shall I add it? I might add it to the grid later and then show that later on.
Yeah.
But I'll let you know. Yeah. So at the moment, D7, C7, and E7 are the highest. So all the sevens. So this looks like it's related to around the around the land.
And Princess Alexandra here. This is
number sevens. So I think I can't see anyone writing at the moment. So I think we've probably got all the votes in for that.
Okay.
So I'll. Oh yeah, and if you can't access it, please write in the chat which grid cells you think activities occurring, and you can write as many grid cells as you like. So I'll stop that poll in a minute, and then we can go on to. It's going to be a very similar one, but we're going to focus on which grid cells you think activities are occurring which are most damaging to seagrass, and then after that we'll go on to coral. So this, I guess, you'll be looking at the activities, but also if you have knowledge of where the habitats are based. So I'll just start the seagrass poll. So it's the same code. So I don't know whether you might have to come out of Slido and type the code in again, or whether it pops up. I don't know if anyone's on it now and is able to see the new poll. Yeah, it should be in which grid cells is damage occurring to seagrass. So I'll just let those answers come in.
And there is a serious purpose to this exercise as well, which we'll get to shortly.
So at the moment, E7, E8, and K4. Ironically, K4.
Oh yeah.
So South Caicos, K4. Yeah, E7, E6, D6. So again around.
And this is for the seagrass.
Yeah, so this is seagrass, because from the habitat maps, there's, I mean, depending on how accurate we think the TNC habitat maps are, there's seagrass in the in kind of the say D4, E3 region, but it depends, you know, if activities are located there or not, whether that's relevant to the vulnerability assessment. Okay, so I think no one's typing at the moment. So yeah, E7, K4, O3, E6. So is O3 maybe a bit further from land? Oh no, that's Grand Turk. Okay, yeah. All right, so I'll do the same again, but this is for coral this time. So in which grid cells is damage occur? Do we think damage is occurring to coral reefs from activities? So that one should be live. So hopefully you can do the same in this one. So yeah, E7 coming out again. So that's obviously an area with activities, but also I think seagrass and coral reef habitat. Yeah, and people taking part in the poll should be able to see the word cloud, so you'll be able to see which grid cells have been entered the most. So yeah, E7, C7, D7 again, O3, Q3, O4 as well. So is that Grand Turk? Yeah. So I'll let that run a little bit longer while people are typing in.
So it's sounding like there is quite a spatial, I'm not going to use the word correlation, but there's a spatial association between the activities and the again where the habitats are most potentially most impacted.
Yeah. Which
was, I guess, what we'd anticipated in the main. But what we're just to take this forward slightly, what we're hoping to build, well, not hoping, what we're planning to do when the in-person workshop takes place in a couple of weeks, is to use a slightly finer grid than that, but allow people to kind of draw into it. So it gives you a much finer control. These are deliberately quite large squares because it's just easier to see on a screen and run through in an exercise like this. But I hope what you get from this is a kind of sense that this is a starting point for a vulnerability assessment. So that's looking at, and we'll go through the different stages of how a grid works, how a grid helps, and what it means in practical terms. But there's a number of interesting concepts that come out of that, which are quite general importance. So I think, Adam, if I continue for now,
yeah,
and if you can then show the pretty table thing that you showed, and then when we get to the bit on the choices.
Yeah, that's good.
Cool. So again, anybody got any questions? So we've been talking about habitat health, condition, and why bother? It's, measuring your health is obviously something that's very straight. I don't think it needs much introduction, but the habitat condition itself may not be necessarily as obvious in terms of why is it useful. If you don't understand how a habitat is changing, the risk obviously is that habitat will collapse or it will degrade to a point that it is no longer able to function in the number of functions that it has. And rather like human health, if you go to see the doctor, the earlier you go to the most medical intervention, the better. Well, certainly that seems to be the medical practice's general advice. The same would be true in looking at biodiversity condition. Early warning is better. It allows you to prepare. It allows you to put in interventions and changes, and maybe even changing the management practice. The way you can evolve on that is looking at MSP, the Marine Spatial Planning, because that is quite dependent in terms of its net regular review to looking at condition, and that's particularly true of looking at management effectiveness in a protected area. It looks at a number of different factors, but one of those is the condition of the habitat. But critically, it's also providing the services that people want and need and depend on. And we're not going to talk about that here because that's going to be covered in another workshop. And also just in general education and stakeholder information and reporting for wider requirements. And one of the things that came out, one of the reasons that we got involved in the first place, Adam and I was looking at the K4 indicator, which is from DEFRA in the UK. But it underpins a lot of things, but more importantly, the condition of the habitat underpins out whether it's going to survive or not, and how well it will survive. To get to that point, it depends on research monitoring and data management, and those are all kind of key things, and we'll go through bits of those as we go through. Where it's in looking at marine spatial planning, so this is the seagrass map that we've got. Marine spatial planning takes into a number of different factors. It looks at socio-economic effects, requirements, it looks at development plans, it looks at a whole raft of marine industries on top of the habitats and so on. Some of it looks very similar to a vulnerability assessment, but I do think there's a slight, there are points at which a true vulnerability assessment is not always used within a marine spatial plan. And that actually comes down to looking at the sensitivities, because the sensitivity is your fine-tuning of whether you think a habitat is affected by a pressure or not. They may coincide in space. You may have cruise tracks that go across a sensitive habitat, but if it's very deep, then it is less likely that the vessel track will actually, or the vessel crossing over will actually cause as much damage. Similarly, if an activity is particularly intense, it will be more damaging than one that's less intense. So there's elements of looking at the severity of the impact as well as the fact that it's just spatially located, but they're all part of this sort of same process. So we have basically three broad ways that we've tried to think about using condition assessment in the past. And you just done one. And that was partly the point between the exercise, that expert judgment is actually quite important still, and probably always will be. We would very unlikely to get pure knowledge of biological responses in terms of what pressures are being applied. There will be an element of judgment called into question. Now, sometimes you can formalize that, and certainly in the UK setting that we've done that through a process called the Delphic method, which is just a formal way of getting people to answer questions in a particular way, and very similar to what we've just done, but more formally, is to look at the number of responses and to then use that as the basis for the overall judgment. It's not usually taken as as a sort of solid scientific evidence, and it's obviously more challengeable by other stakeholders, which is obviously a key consideration. But it still plays a part, and probably always will do. What we're looking at here is the vulnerability assessment, where hopefully we're able to go a bit beyond that, because we're using as much evidence as there is available to look at things like sensitivity, that we look at what the pressures are doing. And you can combine that to some extent with what is going on in terms of what is shown through particularly things like remote sensing, for example. You can look at changes over time. The data requirements for that are obviously a lot more than an expert judgment system would take, but it's still, it tends to be sort of large volume data and wide spatial data. A strength of vulnerability assessment is that it can potentially cover a wide area. And I think that's something that I wouldn't like to lose sight of, because even though your certainty is not as great, it's extremely difficult in a lot of marine settings to be able to look at the wide areas of sea, particularly if you're looking at the sort of wider EEZ side of things. Monitoring is not going to happen in a lot of those places, so you're going to be looking at a proxy, which is what vulnerability assessment kind of does. But the ultimate goal really is to look at indicator-driven assessments, and these Laura will be talking about next week, but the ones where there is a clear relationship between what is happening with the habitat and pressures. In the ideal sense, there are indicators that still work quite well, which are simply just looking at change detection in those habitats, which means that you may not necessarily know why it's being caused, but you certainly know that something needs to be looked into more firmly. So there's it's not a sort of clear cutoff, but there's a general sort of sense that an indicator assessment, excuse me, is linked to the biology. And so linked to what we're trying to do here, so we looked at the sensitivity. We're looking at where's the biggest risk. That's the vulnerability assessment. Again, how is the health change in time? How are you doing with your medication, kind of thing? That's the indicator side of things. And why does it matter to people? That's where the ecosystem services concepts come in. So you're looking at how changes in condition may or may not affect the services. So from a formal sense, the white boxes are what we're looking at. And the one we're looking at today is this one in the top right on vulnerability assessment. So we just thought we'd have a quick recap, because I'm going to start talking now about the pressure side of things, but this is kind of what was covered yesterday. Just in case anybody's had a sort of a rethink or new thinking on what the pressures they think are most important to any of these three. And again, so Adam, do you want to just?
Yeah, so we'll do a Slido poll again. I can't remember yesterday if we just talked generally about pressures and activities, or whether we talked about them in relation to habitats. So I think it'd be useful even if we did talk about particular habitats. So I'll put the code in again. So yeah, if you can enter that into on the Slido website, and same as before, it's the word cloud polls. So the first one is the first question is, what pressures or activities have the highest potential impact on corals? So I'll let people type into that. I'm guessing we'll get similar things to yesterday, but it would be interesting to see how they differ between the three habitats. Yep. So if you're typing, you'll be able to probably or if you've entered something, you should be able to see the word cloud. But at the moment, we've got anchoring, disease, snorkeling, diving, line fishing, illegal fishing, which I don't know if we had yesterday. I can't remember.
We had unregulated fishing.
Okay.
But
yeah, so similar things. Oh yeah, and then more snorkeling and diving in the chat.
But we didn't have those, which is interesting.
Oh, did we not? Okay.
No.
Yeah. Oh, and climate change as well. Obviously, it's disease is probably, going to be a bit more specific to coral, I'm guessing. Dredging as well. Spearfishing. Oh yeah, quite a few dredging boats coming in. Yeah, bleaching, a coral specific one. Yep, garbage. So marine litters, another one that I don't know if we talked about yesterday.
No, I don't think so.
So yeah, harmful fishing practices. So there's various fishing related pressures or activities that have the potential to impact corals. Okay, I think it doesn't look like anyone's typing, so I'll activate the second one. So this is, what pressures or activities have the highest potential impact on seagrass habitats? Again, it's the same code, so hopefully you should be able to see this one. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what similarities and differences there are between the habitats. But yeah, if they're the same, if you've got the same activity and pressures, just type them in again for this habitat. So yeah, dredging and anchoring coming in again. Water sports, which I don't think was mentioned for coral, but maybe that's because people have only just thought of it, or whether it might actually be seagrass specific. Jet skis, littering, another anchoring there, pollutants. Yeah, so again, dredging and anchoring are coming out on top. Sedimentation. Yeah, cruise ships. Okay, I think no one's typing at the moment, so I'll move it on to the last one, which is same question, but this is related to sand habitats this time. So what pressures or activities have the highest potential impact on sand habitats? Sand mining.
Oh, yes.
So that's an interesting one. So dredging again, which as expected, would affect multiple habitats.
But it'd be interesting to know how big a problem sand mining is overall. But...
Yeah, and anchoring again. Yeah, construction. I'm guessing that's related to the sand mining. I'm guessing if the sand's used for construction. Coastal development. Yeah, so maybe there's a bit more, I don't know, a bit more relation to the on-land activities with the sand habitats. Yeah,
which is actually a really interesting finding, if that's what's coming out, that it's because I think there was a sense, I know initially, that sort of the sand habitats are not as biologically rich. They're important because of their supporting fisheries, but it sounds like there's sort of areas of vulnerability that they've got that wouldn't necessarily come up just by looking at the ones that are applicable to seagrass and corals.
Yeah. Oh, and then there's things like beach enrichment and altering beach profiles. So that's kind of sand actually, or the habitat being used as a resource more than just being impacted indirectly by an activity. These activities are actually directly, using the sand. Okay, so I think that's no one's typing at the moment. So yeah, coastal development, sand mining, dredging came out on top. Yeah, so I'll save these results, and we can always, if we want to discuss them later, we can.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. So that brings us on. Essentially, what you've gone through there is it was a slight repeat, but I thought it's an interesting use because we're trying to focus it very much on the individual habitats. This matrix is one that Johnny's team had done, but I still thought it's important to sort of put it in here because it's had such a big impact on the outcome for vulnerability assessment. And this is where you've looked at the pressures caused by all those activities in different ways. And as you see with sand, mostly what we've got there is at the initial end, there's very little evidence, or the sand itself is not sensitive. Reefs are very high to everything, although smothering, if it's only light, is not suggested that it's that sensitive overall. Seagrass has got different responses to different kinds of pressures, bearing in mind that the pressures come from different activities. So it's not a uniform situation, even with the three habitats. And I would say that the three habitats here, we have not differentiated within the habitats in terms of different types. So there are different types of reef, there are different areas of seagrass density and so on. We are just looking at the sort of primary classes. But this was a kind of recap from yesterday. Now I thought we'd just have a quick look so you can see where this is all heading. Some of the ways in which vulnerability has been used as an assessment tool and as a policy tool elsewhere. Mainly sort of, there's no reason why it shouldn't have been a national one, but I have tended to focus on the the intergovernmental conventions that have been doing this. So have a quick look at what OSPAR have done in the North East Atlantic. They're the responsible body for everywhere from Canary Islands up to the Arctic and for the North Sea in the European area. Have a look at a similar one in the Baltic Sea, which is a different regional sea convention. Then have a quick look at reef at risk, which actually came, it's one of the data sets on the TCI data portal, which is looking at Reef Check, which is it's run twice, I think, thus far. I may be wrong on that, but I think the last one was in 2014, where they've used a standard methodology for comparing reefs around the world with generally available socioeconomic data, and then looking at a modelling effect, just briefly, in terms of coastal protection, where you're looking at different types of protection afforded by coral in different conditions. So the OSPAR method is, in some respects, it looks similar to what you'll be seeing for the vulnerability assessment, but there are some quite significant differences. It's a method that's been under development now for about 10 years, and the sophistication levels have grown as a result. But when it started, it was essentially very much a vulnerability assessment approach. So this is kind of how things can grow as your knowledge, data, and stakeholder engagement sort of grow with it. It was determined quite some time ago that the primary pressure on most benthic habitats in the Northeast Atlantic due to fishing. There are others, as indeed there are elsewhere, but in terms of the spatial footprint, fishing is predominant. The map on the left is fishing data, which has to be provided by the fishing fleets. It's CFAS, one of the Blue Belt partners, help collate this, and it's then sent to ICES as the international body. And so these are generally available, well, they are available to interested parties as fishing intensity maps. Fishing is one of the main surface abrasions, so this is essentially our surface abrasion measure. There are lots of other activities that cause abrasion, but at this scale, they are a very small percentage of the total surface area. On the right, they're looking at the final output. This is, as I say, it's a fairly sophisticated model because it's looking at mainly fishing pressure, but also the other pressures on a seabed habitat map, which has been developed partly by Modnet, who are now producing the Caribbean equivalent. And that's including some of the sort of quite detailed seabed mapping as well as model data. So there's a mix of the two. And this then applies a disturbance to the seabed based on all the different pressures that are being caused and the sensitivities to those individual habitats. So the general process that is followed through for this is that the input data, you have species records, habitat maps, sensitivity information linked to those habitat maps. And when I say that, it's relatively straightforward that once you know what the habitats are, as long as you have a sensitivity measure in the, like those tables you just saw, then those are applied directly, that there's no further kind of modeling. And then the pressure data, which is a fishing grid, these are then put together to see where the overlaps are. Those overlaps are then assessed for the magnitude of the impacts, as it says there. So it's not just, is there fishing, it's what type of fishing, is the fishing of relevance to a particular habitat, how much fishing is going on. And it's actually using what is quite a dynamic picture. If you think about the number of fishing boats you're going to have in any given day, how that is then aggregated over a year. So that those kind of things have taken quite a while to come to agreement about. And then you get to the outputs, which are then sort of reported as part of various strategic assessments, but also increasingly starting to be used in terms of evidence for major developments working at this kind of regional scale. I'll put this one up because this is similar but different. This is the one that's used from the Baltic Sea. And what they have done is, when they're looking at the status, is combining different indicators. They've got a lot of spatial indicators. They transform the whole of the Baltic Sea onto a grid, very much at the start of all their assessment processes. And they've used their indicators to say what is happening in those grids. Again, a bit like that exercise that we did, but with quite a sort of fine grid over the whole Baltic. The botting trawling intensity, again, comes from the same kind of fishing data that we saw for the OSPAR one. And this one then comes in as a formalized model, which has, as they all do actually, but it's that the colours there really represent sort of how far you are from a baseline, how are you close to the ultimate sort of the benchmark, which is the kind of the worst case kind of situation for in the indicators, which I think is equivalent, and Johnny, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's equivalent to the benchmarks in the sensitivity context. And then a target, which is a policy target, in quite often, so that you have that you're saying that we want 50% of our seabed to be in good condition, kind of thing, which you can only really determine when you've actually got some sense of what the condition is at the moment. So they use it for the Baltic states. This is one, because Jatavi was asking me about this one, so I thought we'd sort of put this in. I can't claim to have a great deal of knowledge about it. This is done by our coastal resilience team, who've a lot of it's looking at potential impacts from storm damage on land. But in investigating this, we then discovered that they are actually looking at different measures of condition for coral reefs to see if a degraded coral reef is as good at looking at coastal protection as one that's in healthy condition. And there's the top left, there's a paper that seems to spawn quite a lot of the work that was done, and that modelling approach has been used in other territories in the Caribbean by us and by FTEC, I think. So that is looking at condition. So it's an important, and it's fairly crucial in terms of understanding how things are going. I mean, it's typically the K4 indicator that we've been looking at has two components, like so many assessments do. You look at the extent and you look at the condition. Well, the extent is something you can measure from remote sensing in a lot of cases. Condition is not so straightforward, sadly. So I thought to just quickly look at the reef at risks, because it's an example of how to maximize use of existing data. They're looking at overfishing, destructive fishing. They're looking at coastal development, about pollution, whether it's from a watershed or from marine-based pollution. The sources for those data are generally regional in scale. So, and I'm not in a position to say how good they are, how not, because it all depends on what the reporting systems are into those. But they're also looking then at distance from population centres and looking at potential impact on the coast by a modelling approach. Very much looking at where the reefs are and what the location is of the nearest population centre. So it's a risk assessment. It's not a true vulnerability. It doesn't look at sort of whether the reef is particularly vulnerable to a particular pressure at any one point. But it's so they had this one. This map is the one that they generated for 2011. They then did a prediction that this would be the reef in 2030. And that's the bringing the concept of stressors. So they're looking at sort of when the population is increasing and where the new ports may be coming. And there's the 2051, where things are starting to get worse. Again, pretty much around that bay that you've all marked, Princess Alexandra NP. That the method that's been used here has been applied globally by World Resources Institute. It's really a sort of a way forward using those kind of data. what we're going to present shortly is sort of what you can do if you've got, which one of those methods you might want to use, bearing in mind that you would need more knowledge about the biology of the habitats you're looking at if you're using the other methods. So we just wanted to ask now what your feelings were about any of those methods, if you had an opinion, or we were going to put that into a slide. Adam, I've forgotten. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, got another Slido poll. Thanks everyone so far for using Slido. I think it's been pretty useful. So I'll put the code in for this one. This isn't a word cloud. This is just I think it's just like a multiple choice, but you can vote for more than one option. So yeah, so there's the 4 approaches David just outlined. So yeah, just click if you think they might be appropriate either now or in the future for TCI, then click on them. You can choose none of them, all of them, however many you want. So yeah, the first one's the OSPAR approach, which is the BH3 indicator that sort of looks at fishing pressures on the seabed habitat map, kind of similar to vulnerability assessment, but obviously a lot more detailed. I guess there could be, with the eModNet Caribbean map in the future, there could be potential to use that one. The second option is the Baltic Sea assessment, which I don't know much about, but it's a similar method. Is it, David, that one?
It is. I only thought I should have said there that what I wanted to say about that was it's interesting because they have focused on a completely different pressure set, that they are interested primarily in eutrophication, water quality. They suffer a great deal from algal blooms, and whenever we asked, when I used to work with the European Environment Agency, they were much less interested in fishing. So it's quite a contrast. Although there are similarities in a method, what goes into that method is actually quite different.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So obviously the BH3, the OSPAR one, is different pressures, but fishing is the predominant one. And then yeah, option 3 is the modelling the value of coastal protection, which I guess kind of maybe more of a natural capital approach, values the coast, your coral reefs in terms of providing flood protection, and also uses condition assessment. I guess it's almost saying, is the coral reef healthy enough to provide flood protection, and it gives a value for that. And then yeah, the final one is the reefs at risk approach, which David just talked about, that uses data that's, say, readily available regional data to model threats on the reefs into the future. I think there's different scenarios. So yeah, I mean you could think they're all, they could all be useful. So we're getting so far on the multiple choice. I'm not actually sure what the percentages mean on this, but nothing 0. So they've all been clicked by at least one person. So at the moment, I think the reefs at risk approach looks like it's got the most clicks. Maybe that's because it's uses existing data, which is always quite attractive. But yeah, they're all got interest in them, these methods, David.
That's good. We could have stopped there if none of them had come up.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think anyone's typing. So yeah, they all seem interesting approaches, but reefs at risk is the highest, then OSPAR, then modelling the value of coastal flood protection, then the Baltic Sea one.
And that's actually quite an interesting finding. And I will think about that as we go through the next slides. Because reefs at risk is the one that is, as I say, has no biology in it, but it's coming up with something that it does actually reflect development and how development's working. Oopsie, there we go. So we're kind of halfway through now. So I'm now going to talk about specifics about the vulnerability assessment work that we did and tried out using the data that has been put together by yourselves and by colleagues in SERI on the TCI portal, data portal primarily, and also how we put those together with other outputs from other bits of work that have been going on in and around reef health and looking at things like disease. Just a quick recap on the overall method. So you look at a habitat map, you work out how sensitive that to a pressure. You look at an activity. An activity can have multiple pressures. This is something to remember. Then you take each pressure and each sensitivity, habitat sensitivity, and you look at whether that's exposed to that pressure. And this idea of exposure is absolutely core to vulnerability assessment. You then calculate the vulnerability. The calculation is actually less important, I think. It's a reporting exercise, but it's and there's a number of ways of doing it. But essentially, the key thing to determine is your habitat exposed to a pressure that it might be damaged by. So the whole spatial footprint is extremely important. You would need a full, and I think those who saw Johnny's matrices yesterday, we have a big matrix of activities, a slightly smaller one on pressures, but still a fair number. Each one of those pressures then would need to be looked at against each habitat. And to be more certain, you'd be looking at more habitats. And it depends what you define as a habitat. There's you could have quite specific types of reef. You could look at reefs in different kind of functional modes, for example, where there's lots of branching corals, lots of brain corals, or density of seagrass and so on. There's a number of different ways that this can be done. So we'll look at something that's a sort of relatively high level, and hopefully that will get the concepts over. And I think this is also about risk, because what we're actually trying to do is to say, you've got limited resources in terms of priorities. If you're going to be looking at how you might protect, along with all the other things that are going on the land, where is the greatest risk to the reefs, to seagrass? There is an assumption in there, and it may not be the right one, but there is an assumption that you might not be able to protect everything. But this is really looking at where the biggest risks are, so that you put your resources into solving those. And it is just like a risk management exercise in any other sphere, to be honest. It's about the closest that we get in the using marine biological data to come up with an idea of what is the percentage risk. And again, it's like health. You know, if someone tells you you've got a very low risk of any symptoms coming from this, you'll just go away and ignore it. But a lot of people would do. I think I would. But if you're told that you are likely suffering from something, you might need further investigation. Obviously, it's up to you to decide whether you want that or not. But it's still something that you would take a lot more seriously, I would imagine, than if the risk was deemed to be much lower. So this is what we're trying to do here. It is not necessarily giving you a final answer. It's saying that these are the areas that you need to focus on more, and which look to be the most problematic. So again, we're looking at the 3 habitats. We've heard those already. And I'll just talk briefly about mapping and the benthic habitat maps that we use for this. I think Louise Anderson, who's going to be talking about the natural capital work, I can't remember, I think it's either next week or the week after, they talk about the actual map was developed, so I won't go into it too much. But it's one that was, it's on the TCI data portal, and it's the one that was developed primarily with the Nature Conservancy, so using satellite data that was interpreted, and I think it was some ground truthing, and we had some input into that ourselves, I think, and I think you all did, or certainly DCI had some input into it. But essentially that was agreed quite early on in this project that this was going to be the core base map. Because it was primarily based on satellite data, and and interpretive studies, I can't give any information about how accurate it might or may not be. That's something that we would sort of say, leave to you to come back to us and say that this needs you're investigating. It is probably the best of breed in terms of what can be done through satellite mapping. That's the impression I get. To improve it would need much more in situ monitoring. And so part of this sort of whole process of looking at risk is, again, how important is it to you to know exactly where everything, where the coral boundaries are, where the seagrass boundaries are, where the delineation is with the sand, and so on. And that's not something you can answer scientifically. It's something that actually comes out of a sort of policy and resource management exercise. And if you think back to the OSPAR work, that was exactly what was happening there. That base map started off much more crude than this, because it was actually done. You can't use most of the OSPAR area is quite deep, so remote sensing doesn't work. Well, Earth observation doesn't work, so they have to rely to a large extent on looking at acoustic methods, so echo sounders to sort out what's happening on the seabed, coupled with surveys. So the accuracy of those maps has improved over the years as more surveys have been done, and as a result, the confidence in the results has grown. So there's that. It's a trade-off between more work and more monitoring, and actually feeling much more confident about putting recommendations based on these kind of things. I think that's what I alluded to here, that there's sort of different levels of mapping to use satellites. There's increasingly sort of the localized remote sensing. I know DSR have drones and I think use LiDAR, sort of radar scattering. Those are the methods that are sort of delineated through the regional and sort of wider monitoring programs. Include a mix of transect-based monitoring and the remote sensing type thing. When I say remote sensing, that's anything that's using a camera of whether that's a radar or a photo or a satellite. So it's not just satellite data. But again, most of that will be talked under the natural capital work, so I wasn't going into the monitoring side of things today. But what I did want to talk today is linked to what we were talking about yesterday about mapping of activities and pressures. Now, this is a map that was derived from the data, also derived from the pressures workshop that was held. I forget the date. Johnny, you can let me know. But the team there had a workshop with yourselves, asking those questions again. Where are the key pressures? And putting a pin, essentially, so it's a pin mapping exercise about where those maps go. And that is by far the commonest way of doing activity mapping. It's the question you need to answer for vulnerability assessment is, while those are point locations, how wide an influence from that part is there from that point location for each one of those activities? And that actually gets a bit harder. And this goes back to that exercise that we tried at the beginning of having the big squares and asking you to just name a square or two, because that's what we have to do, is basically to get to something that is a density map or a heat map. It can be, you can describe it in all sorts of different ways, but it's essentially a continuous surface of, there is a likelihood of an activity taking place here. There's a lot of activity taking place in this place and none in another. And it's how you transform your activity data into that kind of heat map exercise is quite key to the vulnerability assessment, and anything similar for that matter. So you've got kind of three broad ways of doing it that we've thought about in the past. The one on the left is you take a point that we've done and you put a buffer around them that's in a GIS context, but essentially you just look at sort of how far you think that point will extend in terms of its influence on the sea. There's a grid that we've been looking at. So here you have the grid can be standardized, which is one of its great advantages. And you're looking at the number of activities that occur within, or point data within that grid. Or you can use a model, which can be developed from either from points or from grids, or it can be done from other things like satellite imagery. Will provide you with a map. It's essentially a grid of points, but it's still a very fine grid. But it's and it will tell you other information, or it can come from other records. So the one we've got up there is actually from ship tracks. So from the global ship tracking exercise, that will provide you with shipping density. This is quite a sort of general question, so I was just sort of interested to see sort of any initial thoughts on what your views were about the pros and cons of any one of these particular methods. Adam, did we have a slider on this one?
No, I didn't have one set up for this.
That's all right. So I'll just leave it as a general question. If anybody just wants to respond, if you just want to put your hand up or just talk out, because we'd just be interested in see if anybody's actually looked at this on island anyway, or how it's being done. I mean, I know there's fishing data in grids, but that's the only one that I've come across that actually exists at the moment. So has anybody got any particular thoughts or comments at this stage? That's okay.
David,
sorry.
what was that? Oh no, sorry.
I think we were going to say the same thing, Adam, so you go on.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say there's a question about the approaches to the kind of different sensitive or risk assessments, so like the BH3 approach. So yeah, Rebecca asked, with those various approaches, is it possible to take into account the synergy of different pressures? So I wasn't sure. So I know lots of the approaches look at multiple pressures, but I'm not sure how like the interactions between the pressures and is kind of analysed. But I'm not sure if do you know, David?
Yes, it's a really good question. In fact, it's probably the #1 question these days. And the answer is no, they don't. But they are trying to. The problem with I like the word synergy. It's in the OSPAR term they use cumulative pressures, where you've got multiple things happening at the same point in time. It's been done in theory, but not on a map. It's not been used. So you're just looking at the essentially how it's improved, or quite often actually it's probably more likely to make things worse if you've got multiple pressures acting in one place. What difference does it make to the habitat underneath? Actually, it's not true. Sorry, I will take that back. That is not always true. If there is something that changes the habitat and another pressure comes along, the habitat may have changed sufficiently that there's no longer any damage caused. I think that's relatively uncommon from what I remember. It was something we looked at ourselves in a trial basis, trying to do a model for cumulative pressures. It's now seen as the priority for the work that's being done in OSPAR. And if Christina was here, she'd be able to talk a little bit more about that. But it's quite a tricky area, but it is an important area. And just putting a load of pressure maps on top of each other is missing that point that there is actually some interplay between how the pressures change a habitat. Does that help?
Yep, got a thank you in the chat.
Okay, cool. Right. So I won't go into this one much. I realize I'm going to have to speed up a little. This is a grid approach, and you'll see an example in a minute, but it's basically a slightly finer grid than before. I'm pretty sure this was based on the fisheries data that was available.
Oh, David, you've gone on to mute.
I heard a little peep, but I didn't press anything. I did not. This is the formal theory bit for a vulnerability assessment, and it's not, I hope, it's a big matrix of stuff. It is not that sophisticated, and it is intentionally not that sophisticated because it's relevant to the level of knowledge that you've got. So with the sensitivities, they can be quite heavily defined with exposure, with the thresholds. The exposure is quite a key concept, but it's also quite difficult to really quantify, and it's really down to if you've got something that's damaging. If you've got dredging, for example, if well, probably not the best example. If you've got anchoring, what is light anchoring? What is heavy anchoring? Is it a number of boats? Is it different sorts of anchors? Each kind of pressure would need to have an associate level of intensity, in a sense, which is not always available, and it is not something we've been able to apply in this case because it simply hasn't been done for many of the kind of activities that we're looking at. We have it for fishing, where fishing data is routinely caught in a sort of standardized way because it includes the number of fish hauls in a particular grid square. That's probably the only way that you can get kind of a relative exposure. But what we can look at is just, is something exposed and it is sensitive, and it may be low, moderate or high sensitive. So that's the theory behind vulnerability assessment. So I'm just going to go through, and I think it can be done sort of reasonably quickly, is just to show the whole process in action, going through the map based on the data that we had available through the project, but also the little icon-y things at the top right, which hopefully show you where you are in the process. So we start with the habitat map, and although we were looking at reef and sand and seagrass, I mean, there's also areas of other kinds of algae and also disturbed areas and mud. That's the sort of primary classes. I mean, it's in the map itself is in more detail, but we aggregated it up for purposes of doing this vulnerability work. When you look at the sensitivity, and we've taken again surface abrasion as being an important pressure, and it's one that is where the responses are different between seagrass and coral. So this then is looking at the sensitivity of the whole seabed to abrasion, and it's based on those three habitats. If you have more sensitivity data, you've got more knowledge about what the responses are of different species, then you could make an even more detailed map. It's pretty detailed now, but this is looking at it not from a habitat point of view, but at a particular pressure, and you'd want one of these for each of the pressures that you're concerned about. There's our activity map again, and this would be a pressure map, but looking at radius of influence of each one of those activities. If you've got it's possible that you can have different radius of activity. So maybe a jet ski has got a jet ski's influence will be much wider than a standard paddleboard, for example. I assume so, but getting the metrics for that can be quite challenging, but it's not impossible, and it's something we've been trying in the UK for different kinds of pressures. This is looking at pretty much the same data, but on a density map. So it's the number of point data sources that were within each of those squares that I showed earlier. So that would then lead you with the purple areas, which are the density match, which actually matches up pretty well with what you came up with the original large square for the island. Now, obviously, each point is maybe the average point of a radius of activity. There's always going to be edge effects, so that is it one side of is it in one square, or should it be in a square next to it as well? If you've got enough data, the rationale has been that basically it averages out those kind of uncertainty effects that come in. And then you overlay from whichever pressure method you think appropriate, and you overlay that onto your sensitivity map. And that essentially then leads to your vulnerability. So here you've got 3 levels of vulnerability, which are by and large based on the sensitivity scores, because we don't, and in this case, we use the number of points of activity that were identified. And I'm not going to say that they weren't designed to do that, so it's not a realistic method in that respect. But if you were to collect sort of the number of occurrences of jet skis in a particular area, it's the kind of thing you can do with sort of drone monitoring at times, but or shoreline monitoring, the number of different types of water sports, and so on within a square. This is the kind of sort of output that you could aim for. So you're looking, and there we are. I don't know if you can see the pointer, but in exactly the squares that you marked out, those are the vulnerability to abrasion are sort of coming up. So I just wanted to go quickly now to look at a specific case of looking at seagrass. And this is almost a kind of, it's not a plea exactly, but it's also to say that where we can get so far with that kind of vulnerability mapping, what we'd really like to be able to do to give a more confident answer is link that to what we know about the actual biology. Now, from the original map, we have 2 classes of seagrass entities on those maps. We have dense seagrass and sparse seagrass. This is the one from the Nature Conservancy. In principle, the dense seagrass is notionally at a higher condition, or at least that's kind of how it's normally sort of represented. And then we're also looking at where the MPAs are constructed, where they're covering the seagrass beds, and then we just put on the activity maps as well. So if you're looking at seagrass, you're looking at a number of layers where these are causing pressures that the seagrass itself is sensitive to. But this is just a set of the four of the species. And these ones, I think, again, Johnny will correct, but it's ones that were looked at in the sensitivity work. And also it's very similar to what was done with the European Environment Agency in the Mediterranean, where they have a similar range of different kinds of seagrass. And I think one of the questions that comes up for this is when you're looking, if you're mapping sparse seagrass, which is what the satellite will see, is that because it's a different species, or is it because there's been a lot of damage or reduction in the seagrass extent because of things like anchoring? This is where in situ monitoring, to know how to interpret the remote sensing maps, can be particularly useful, because one of the things that Johnny's team work came up with is the fact that the different seagrasses do have different responses. There's a different recovery rate, for example, with turtle grass than the others do. So whereas we would, I think it would be typically done by looking at seagrass as a single entity, this would be of more use. And certainly when it comes to looking at the ecosystem services, I think there's some quite strong links and reasons for looking at or having in situ monitoring to help improve the vulnerability assessment work. And that also links into the indicators they're doing. It'll be even more, well, not even more complicated, but there's different approaches to looking at corals and looking at the difference between different forms of corals and the different kind of ecosystems that the reef would have. But hopefully this will sort of make the point that there's a sort of vulnerability assessment, particularly just solely from a a remote sensed image will get you so far, but it's still going to have a lot of questions that people might challenge you on. And I guess the plea in this is to more in situ monitoring. If this is something that's going to be of concern, that will help you to get you to a better response. So we just wanted to ask this question. Was this on a Slido? Sorry, I have forgotten what we agreed on the Slido. Or is this
no Slido for this either?
That's fine. Yeah. Yeah, I thought we had 3, didn't we? So I'm going to just leave that up for the minute. And if anybody wants to type any points into the chat, but I think this is something we can sort of pick up at the end. It's the interpretation of these maps is actually quite key. So knowing answers to this sort of question is quite important. Now, you may not have to monitor that often if your remote sensing can pick up the difference in between, because you've got a continuous monitoring system there. But it's useful to know, in fact, quite important to know sort of what the differences might be. And I'll put this in because one of the things is also the importance of scale. And we talked about mooring in particular. And this one, I thought, made the point really rather well, that you've got a lot of regulated mooring sites, which all neatly miss the seagrass beds as mapped. So that shows that the regulation process has worked. And I know in conversations that we've had up to now that the big concern is about the unregulated mooring. So in a way, what this is saying is there is no exposure for regulated mooring on seagrass. So you can then not prioritize that. You need to be looking more at the unregulated sites where mooring might take place, which might help in terms of resource allocation. And that's partly how this all feeds into marine spatial planning. It's part of the evidence structure for marine MSP. It is looking at changes at the biological level, because you've got a protected area that is designed to help protect certain features. Are they helping? Are things getting better or worse in or out of those marine protected areas? So we're looking at the sensitivity assessment is linked to all of that and helps to say that this is what is happening if pressures change. Caveats. I don't want it to come across as too negative. I think it's a really valuable tool, and we've used it ourselves very often, and we've used it particularly in situations where it's been difficult or way too expensive to do regular monitoring. But there are, like with anything like that, where it looks good, I think it looks good, that the maps are, they have hidden issues that you just need to be aware of, and particularly when maps like this are being used as part of a planning exercise. A lot will depend on how good your underlying data sets are, the confidence that you've got within each layer that you're using. Are you going to be able to do it again in a year's time or 2 years' time, or is it something that will take 10 years of work to come through again? How good are they at looking at comparing each scale? An example here, I mean, one of the things that came up yesterday when we were talking about health was looking at sargassum. Now, we did have a sargassum likelihood map, I think, but it's a very, I forget what it is, it's quite a lot of kilometres wide as its base unit, which meant that when it comes to looking at vulnerability assessment, the base unit, because it was a regional scale product, I think covered pretty much all of the islands. So it is a problem. It's not a problem. It's not giving you much kind of management control. False correlations, always important in the marine side of things, and I always forget, and so do a lot of other people when we used this in the past. It might well be that you might have a lot of fishing activity, for example, but if it's pelagic fishing, it's not going to affect the seabed. So fishing data, you need to know what kind of gear it is. Is it something that is going to be impacting on the seabed? And it's even more obviously the case where you've got very deep waters. Land-based methods are quite often used in a kind of vulnerability assessment kind of way, and they're not as appropriate in the marine sphere, where depth can make such a you've got in the shallow coastal waters, it's much less important, obviously, but once you start moving offshore, it's hard. Vulnerability assessment doesn't show trends particularly well, because given the variability of the data in each, if you've got a grid cell kind of process, the variability within each cell is high. It's not each cell that you're looking at necessarily, it's the sort of a region, it's a focus. The pressure can move from one cell to another without affecting the overall result. But if you try doing a time series like that, it will make quite a difference. Proper condition indicators will be better for looking at trends. And quite a key one is it will only show you what the risks are from what you know. They won't. So in other words, if you've put data onto your maps, it'll only tell you that it's responding to those data. It does not tell you in absolute terms. And I think this goes back to that question that Rebecca was saying about cumulative effects. It's also including effects that come from things that you hadn't thought about or are not representable in a map at this stage. And looking at a new disease will be a good example. Until it's mapped, you can't use it as a pressure, and if you won't necessarily know that all your habitats are being affected by a disease unless you've got in situ monitoring. So the vulnerability assessment won't cover you for that. But despite that negativity, what it does give you is a broad area look, which is quite hard to do with other methods. If you link it to in situ and regular monitoring, and particularly for specific condition indicators, where you've got the key concerns, where you've put more resources into those kind of things, linking those up will give you probably the best of all worlds, really, because you've got something that is looking at the sea as a whole, as well as the individual biological response, the sort of dose response type thing that we talk about. But it might also be therefore helpful for the vulnerability assessment to show where the highest risks are in the first place. So there we go. It identifies the risks to marine systems, and that's its primary job and its primary aim. And it can do assesses condition of wide areas, and it's using proxy measures. In principle, they're ones that are easier to collect because you're not doing in situ monitoring, with all the caveats of how uncertain that may or may not be. The confidence is up to the level of detail that you want to put in there. The sensitivity scoring is fairly critical, and if certainly one of the things that come out of the work we've been doing, that will be something that will be good to look at again in terms of the more refined the sensitivity scores are for any particular region, the better confidence you'll have in your vulnerability work. And this just goes back to, it can't look at all potential effects, it will just look at what is measured. But if you link that to a particularly a biological metric, like some of the coral monitoring, for example, you're looking there at changes happening, and that's going back the other way, that you're looking from where a change has happened to what may have caused that, which will enable you to see that condition is variable. So again, you work alongside biological indicators. And we're just going to finish now with, and that's it really. We can do one of two things. We can, I mean, Adam, have you got the Slido polls to hand? Did you, if you wanted to show them? We've got a set of questions here. These are not, these are really to sort of help us kind of sort of think about how we're to wrap up the project as it stands at the moment, but also in terms of the kind of questions that would need answering if you were going to be using vulnerability assessment, and how. So there's starts of conversations rather than definitive answers. So we're going to sort of leave them towards the end and then sort of wrap up. But I think, Adam, if you've got those to hand,
yeah,
so I kind of threw that at you, but
so I've put the kind of numbers for the grids together for the first question. I don't know whether it's worth me sharing it. It's just an Excel sheet. It's not on a map.
okay,
but,
okay.
But it'd be useful for us. But yeah, so activities that potentially damaging, definitely grouped around the land. So similar to the vulnerability map that you had. So let me just have a look at the map quickly. Yeah, so grouped around kind of South Caicos, Grand Turk, and Provo as well. So as expected, really. Same. So seagrass and corals both broadly the same. There may be a few more activities related to corals, not so land-based, but they only had 1 vote for each. So I'm not sure what we can say about that. But yeah, as expected, linked to land. And then in terms of the approaches you outlined, the 4 approaches to kind of risk vulnerability assessment, I managed to find out a number of votes. So mapping reefs at risk had the most votes. So 5 votes altogether. OSPAR benthic habitat assessment had 4 votes, and then modelling the value of coastal protection had 3 votes, and the Baltic Sea status assessment had 2 votes. So yeah, those methods all seemed of interest. Maybe the reefs at risk one was most interest because there's data available. The OSPAR method would obviously require more in-depth fisheries data to be collected. And then in terms of the other Slido poll, so in terms of the threats to each habitat, each of the 3 habitats, yeah, dredging came out as, so when I actually looked at all the votes, dredging came out as top, and anchoring for corals. Same with seagrass. So dredging and anchoring seem to be the 2 for seagrass and coral, and then coastal development, sand mining for sand. So seagrass and coral kind of map each other a bit more with the threats. Yeah, so that was it from the Slido stuff.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. So that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. Has anybody got any questions, thoughts, comments? Those open questions are there for eliciting response. Yeah. Rebecca?
Yes, good morning. I had a question about an activity, for example, kayaking, which, if you think about kayak, you wouldn't necessarily think about a big pressure on the seagrass if there's some. But let's say it's an area where there could be 200 kayaks per day. And so then the pressure becomes something to be, I would say, looked at. How would that be reflected, or where could that be incorporated in an assessment like this?
I was just thinking about that, and I mean, Johnny, this is sort of your area as well. It's again, do chip in, but from off the top of my head, I think one of the things that what you're talking about there is intensity of that pressure. So if you have things like drone mapping that can identify, I'm trying to think whether kayaks show up that well. Possibly not. It tends to work better with sort of motorized boating, but if it's possible to pick up that kind of data through that, you would need to have at a regular part of the day, because otherwise you're going to get sort of diurnal effects. You know, if everything's measured at 7 a.m., it's less likely that people are going to be out on the water and so on. Where I think what is actually quite an interesting part of your question too is looking at if there was evidence as to whether kayaking is worse in very shallow waters. If you've got the depth, which I think we have, I think there is the depth rate, that could be added in as part of a combined map. So it would be an intensity map of kayaking, depending on whether it's actually affecting the seagrass. But again, if it's beyond a certain depth, I imagine that the effect is going to be quite low. Johnny, you've come online, so I assume you've got the right answer.
Well, just to say, this is why we were keen to have workshops with stakeholders to kind of ask these questions and get input about which activities do occur. So something like kayaking, it's probably not something in the UK we'd associate with a large amount of pressure, because we don't have the numbers really, or the habitats which would be affected. But I think those workshops where we'd have those discussions, and if you did think that was a problem, we could look at which pressures we thought would be related to that activity, and then we could make sure those pressures are included in the sensitivity assessments. And then from there, it'd be on to David to work out how to map those pressures and combine them with the sensitivity assessments. So there is definitely scope within this process to have a think about which activities and which pressures you think are the most relevant and are potentially causing the most damage. And they can definitely be worked in at various stages to make sure that they're included in any outputs at the end, so you can really make sure they're considered in any marine spatial planning activities.
And just to say that there is a kind of a method for the, again, going back to the OSPAR methods and indeed the HELCON methods, where they're looking at fishing intensity. It's kind of a similar problem in one way. They're looking at the number of fishing vessels with a particular type of gear active in a grid square over the course of, I think it's a day. I'd actually have to look that up again. I can't remember offhand about what the formula is, but it is something like that they know, because they've got in that case they've got an automatic identification system that they called VMS, that's telling you where the vessels are, so they just track that. Obviously kayaks don't have that, to my knowledge, but maybe that's a question. Could they be fitted with trackers that would give you that kind of density information? But so it's a way that it's been handled for fishing. It would be a bit harder, I think, getting core data for kayaking, unless you could track them.
Yeah, maybe something with jet skis as well, with the monitoring, tracking you could think about. But in terms of the vulnerability assessment, even if so say you've map a pressure to kayaking that could potentially have an impact, even if the habitat has a low sensitivity to that pressure, if there's a high exposure value, it still comes out in the vulnerability assessment as moderately vulnerable. So then that would be considered as a potential risk. So the exposure, you're looking at both exposure and sensitivity.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Answered very well.
I mean, we're happy to answer questions, and I think Jatalia said that she was going to circulate sort of emails, so that if you did want to ask anything, they're happy to receive those. I think it just had there we go. So there's 2 more discussions to come. One is looking at, I've said a number of times about the benefit of using proper biological indicators, and the next one will be looking at the ecosystem services. So those are coming over the next 2 weeks. And I'll have to hand back to Emma at that point because I can't remember which order they come in and which days they're on. So Emma, if you could just remind people.
Yep, so we've got, the first one on indicators is Wednesday the 14th of June, and it's at the same time. And then the following online session is Tuesday the 20th of June, the same time as well. And then the in-person workshop is the week of the 26th of June.
So thank you for listening. And as I say, if you, sure Tavia can give you our emails if need be. And then we do have this post-workshop question about whether this has helped in understanding or not. So there's Slido again, and there's the code. So please do answer. It's always helpful to know what the responses are going to be, and whether it's actually made it any clearer or not. So other than that, thank you for attending. And I'll just hand back quickly to Emma in case there's anything further she wants to add from a project coordination point of view.
No, I think that's everything, David. Thank you very much. Yep, I'll pop the codes for that. It's just one question in the Slido on how you feel your understanding is now following yesterday and today's workshop. And the other code is just to provide any general feedback you have on the session so that we can improve in the future. And Petrina, I've just seen your comment in the chat about sending yesterday's recording, so no problem, I'll send that over and I can circulate everyone emails to everyone if you have any more questions. So yeah, that's everything, and thank you very much for joining the session. I hope you have a lovely weekend.
Indeed. Goodbye all.
Thanks everyone.